My name is Kelsey Hartman. I was 41 years old when I discovered that my husband's best friend had spent 3 years systematically destroying my marriage, and that my husband had helped him do it. I was a forensic accountant working for a litigation support firm in Denver, Colorado. My job was to follow money through the places people tried to hide it: shell accounts, altered invoices, layered transfers designed to look like something they were not. I had testified in 11 federal cases. I had made grown men cry on the stand by reading their own spreadsheets back to them. I thought I was difficult to manipulate. The correction arrived on an ordinary Wednesday in October. I came home to find my husband, Greg, sitting at the kitchen table with his phone face down and a look I had seen before on defendants who had just been served. He told me he needed to talk. He told me our marriage had problems he had been afraid to raise. He told me he had been confiding in his best friend, Derek Calloway, for the past 2 years, and that Derek had helped him see how unhappy he had been. He said he wanted a divorce. I told him I needed a week to process it. He said that was fair. He moved to the guest room that night, and I sat in our bedroom and thought about the fact that I had spent the past 2 years believing we were fine. Disagreements, yes. Distance, yes. But fine. By the following morning, I had begun to understand that fine had been a managed condition. Managed by someone else. Derek Calloway had been Greg's best friend since college. He had stood at our wedding. He had been in our home hundreds of times, at dinners, at holidays, at long weekends when we all drove up to the cabin Greg's family owned in the mountains. His wife Sandra had been someone I considered a close friend. We had taken a trip together to Portugal 2 years earlier, just the two of us, while Greg and Derek stayed behind for a fishing trip that I later realized had not involved any fishing. I had liked Derek. I had trusted him in the way you trust someone who has been woven so long into the fabric of your life that removing them would require pulling threads from everything else. That was the design. I understood it later. The week Greg gave me passed slowly. He was courteous in the way people are when they have already made a decision and are managing your reaction to it. On the 4th evening, he left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he showered. I was not snooping. I was pouring coffee. The screen showed an email thread. I am a forensic accountant. I read fast. I read accurately. I retained what I saw. The thread was between Greg and Derek. It went back 26 months. The earliest message I caught before the screen dimmed was from Derek. It read, in part, that Greg needed to stop letting Kelsey run the marriage, or he would wake up at 50 with no identity of his own. I stepped back from the counter. I did not touch the laptop. I noted the date and the approximate timestamp, and I went to bed. I did not sleep. Before I tell you what was in the rest of those emails and what Derek had been doing with my husband for 2.5 years, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this goes. The next morning, Greg left early for work. I contacted our family attorney, a woman named Catherine Boyle, and told her I needed an emergency consultation before doing anything else. Catherine had handled our wills and our property deed. She was meticulous and unmoved by most things. When I finished describing the email, she told me to document what I had seen, not to access the laptop again without legal guidance, and to begin separating any jointly held accounts that were within my sole authority. She also told me not to discuss the divorce with Greg until we had spoken again. I spent the next 6 days reconstructing what I could from memory and from what was accessible to me legitimately. Greg and I had a shared financial dashboard I had set up years earlier for household budgeting. I had full access. What I found in it was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was methodical. Over the previous 18 months, Greg had made a series of transfers out of our joint savings account. None of them were large enough individually to trigger a conversation. The largest was $4,000. The smallest was $800. 12 transfers in total. Combined, $31,000. They had been distributed across 3 different dates, always on weekdays when I was traveling for depositions or client reviews. The destination account was labeled in the dashboard only as personal savings. I did not have access to that account. I had not thought to ask about it because we had agreed years earlier that we would each maintain a small personal reserve. $31,000 was not a personal reserve. I printed every transfer record, cross-referenced them against my travel calendar, and placed them in a folder. Then I called Catherine again. She told me to find a forensic divorce attorney. The attorney I retained was named David Park. He had 20 years of experience in high-asset divorce cases in Colorado and a reputation for being thorough in a way that made opposing counsel uncomfortable. I liked him immediately. I told him everything, including the email I had seen, the transfers, and the fact that Derek Calloway had been a constant presence in the months leading up to Greg's announcement. David asked me to describe my relationship with Derek in detail. I did. He asked whether Derek had ever offered Greg financial advice. I paused and then said yes, actually, several times. Derek worked in private wealth management. He had recommended the brokerage where Greg kept his individual investment account. He had suggested the structure of Greg's bonus deferrals. He had once, over dinner, explained to Greg at length why maintaining separate accounts within a marriage was a sign of financial maturity rather than distrust. David wrote that down. He asked whether Derek and Sandra were still together. I said as far as I knew. He asked whether I had spoken to Sandra since Greg's announcement. I said no. He suggested I not reach out to her yet. I asked why. He said he wanted to understand the full shape of what had happened before I closed any doors. What David's investigator found over the following 4 weeks did not surprise me the way it might have surprised someone who had not spent 15 years reading financial fraud. It surprised me in a different way. The kind of surprise that arrives when you realize the pattern you are looking at is not random. It was constructed. Derek had been advising Greg informally for years. That was established and, on its face, unremarkable. What emerged from the investigation was something different. Derek had, over a period of approximately 2.5 years, been actively coaching Greg toward divorce. This was documented in the email thread, which Greg had stored in a folder he believed was private, and which David's team was able to access through legitimate discovery once the divorce filing was made. The emails covered a range of topics. They included Derek explaining to Greg that our prenuptial agreement, which I had proposed early in our engagement, was a form of control I had used to protect my assets at Greg's expense. This was technically accurate in the narrow sense that my premarital assets were protected. It omitted the fact that Greg had reviewed and signed the agreement with his own attorney present and had never once raised an objection in 14 years of marriage. The emails included Derek advising Greg on how to structure the personal savings account in a way that would be difficult to trace within standard discovery. He had recommended a specific institution and a specific account type. He had outlined, in a message Greg had kept, the threshold below which individual transfers typically avoided automatic flagging by financial monitoring systems. Derek Calloway was a licensed financial advisor. He knew exactly what he was describing. The emails also included a series of messages about me personally. Derek had spent considerable energy over those 26 months building a version of me for Greg to believe in. I was controlling. I was emotionally unavailable. I had never truly supported Greg's ambitions. My career had always taken precedence. The marriage had always been on my terms. Some of those things had partial truth in them, the way a forged document always contains some accurate information. What made them dangerous was the accumulation. Delivered over 2 years to a man who trusted the sender completely, they had functioned as a slow replacement of Greg's actual experience with a revised one. I read those emails sitting in David's conference room on a Tuesday afternoon in November. I read them twice. Then I closed the folder and told David I wanted to understand what Derek's legal exposure looked like. David explained it carefully. Derek had not committed fraud in the criminal sense. What he had done existed in a complicated space. He was not Greg's financial advisor of record, which meant his advice fell outside regulatory oversight. The transfers Greg had made were from a joint account Greg had equal legal right to access. The emails were damaging but did not constitute a crime in themselves. What they did constitute, David told me, was material evidence of dissipation of marital assets and potentially tortious interference, depending on how aggressively we wanted to pursue it. I asked what pursuing it aggressively would require. He told me. I said, let's begin. David filed the divorce petition in December. The financial disclosures Greg was required to submit confirmed the personal savings account and its balance. $29,000 remaining after several unexplained withdrawals in the weeks following his announcement. The transfers from our joint account were documented and categorized as dissipation. Greg's attorney argued the transfers represented legitimate personal savings accumulated over the marriage. David presented the transfer dates against my travel calendar. He presented Derek's emails advising Greg on transfer thresholds. He presented testimony from a financial behavior expert about the pattern and timing of the withdrawals. Greg's attorney pivoted and argued that our prenuptial agreement unfairly protected my premarital assets while leaving Greg financially vulnerable throughout the marriage. David pointed out that Greg had earned a competitive salary for 14 years, had received six figures in bonuses over that period, and had made no claim of financial hardship at any point during the marriage. He also noted that the person who had characterized the prenuptial agreement as exploitative in Greg's own communications was not Greg but a third party with no legal standing in the marriage. The judge asked Greg directly whether he had felt financially constrained during the marriage. Greg said he had sometimes felt that his contributions were undervalued. The judge asked whether he had raised that with me at any time. Greg said not directly. The judge asked why not. Greg said Derek had helped him understand that I would not have responded well. The judge asked who Derek was. Greg said his best friend. The courtroom was quiet for a moment. Derek's role became central to the asset dissipation finding. The emails established that he had provided specific financial structuring advice designed to minimize what I would recover in the divorce, advice that benefited Greg and, as David had discovered, Derek as well. Greg's personal savings account had been opened at an institution where Derek managed accounts. A small referral arrangement existed between Derek's employer and that institution. It was disclosed, technically, in documentation Greg had signed. Greg had not understood what he was signing. Derek had referred his best friend to a product that generated Derek a fee while simultaneously making the assets in that account harder to trace in a divorce proceeding. David filed a civil complaint against Derek for tortious interference with the marital relationship and breach of fiduciary duty arising from his informal financial advisory role. Derek's attorney called it frivolous. David called it documented. Sandra called me 3 days after the civil filing. I had not spoken to her in months. She said she did not know the extent of what Derek had done, and that she was not calling to defend him. She said she had found the same email thread on their shared computer and that she had her own attorney now. I told her I was sorry. I meant it. She had also trusted him. If someone in your life has ever decided for you how your relationship was supposed to end, drop a comment. I want to know how many of you have been there. The divorce was finalized in March. The settlement required Greg to return the dissipated funds with interest and to pay a portion of my legal fees based on the court's finding that his financial conduct during the proceedings had been deliberately obstructive. The prenuptial agreement held. My premarital assets remained protected. The marital assets were divided according to Colorado law with adjustments for dissipation. Greg kept the mountain cabin. It was in his family before we married and I had not wanted it. I kept the house in Denver, our investment accounts, and 14 years of financial records organized in labeled folders that had once made Greg laugh at dinner parties when he described his wife's idea of romance. He was not laughing now. Derek's civil case settled 8 months later. He did not admit liability. The settlement amount was confidential under terms his attorney had insisted on. What was not confidential was the regulatory complaint David filed with the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, citing Derek's undisclosed referral arrangement and the documented pattern of financial advice provided outside his registered capacity. That investigation was still open at the time I stopped following it. I stopped following it because it was no longer mine to manage. Sandra divorced Derek the same month the civil case settled. She sent me a message that said only, "I finally read everything." I wrote back that I hoped she was okay. She said she was getting there. So was I. The hardest part of what happened was not the legal process. The legal process I understood. It had rules and timelines and a defined outcome. The hardest part was the retrospective. The 2.5 years of dinners and holidays and weekends at the cabin I now had to review through a different lens. Every conversation with Derek in which he had been warm and funny and genuinely interested in how I was doing. Every moment I had felt like the four of us were a kind of chosen family. Every time I had told Sandra how lucky we were that our husbands were so close. He had been present for all of it and engineering something beneath the surface of all of it at the same time. Greg, I had eventually come to understand, was not a villain. He was a person who had trusted the wrong voice for too long and had not had the courage to question it. That did not erase what he had done. The transfers were real. The concealment was real. The 2.5 years of a marriage slowly being redirected toward an exit he had been coached toward, those were real. But his culpability and Derek's were different things, and I had needed time to separate them before I could think clearly about either. I spent several months after the divorce doing very little outside of work. I took cases I found technically absorbing. I ran in the mornings. I had dinner with Catherine Boyle twice and with my sister once a month, and with no one else for a long time. It was not depression exactly. It was more like the period after a complex audit closes, when the intensity drops suddenly, and you have to remember what your life is about when it is not about the case. I had built a good life. I had built it carefully, and with attention to detail, and with a thoroughness that some people found excessive. That thoroughness had also meant that when someone tried to dismantle it from the inside, the records were there, the documentation existed, the pattern was legible. I had been protected, without knowing I needed protection, by the same habits people had made jokes about at dinner. I do not think often about whether I should have seen it coming. The question implies a kind of vigilance that is not sustainable in a marriage or in any relationship where trust is the foundation. You cannot audit the people you love in real time. You cannot approach intimacy with the same skepticism you apply to a suspect balance sheet. If you do, you have already lost something more important than money. What I think about instead is the design of what Derek built. The patience of it. The 26 months of consistent, quiet pressure applied to a man who was already uncertain, in a voice he trusted completely. It was sophisticated in a way that should not be minimized, because the target was a marriage rather than a corporation. Manipulation does not become less serious because it is personal. I kept one email from the discovery file. Not Derek's, Greg's. It was from about a year before he told me he wanted a divorce, during a period when, based on the thread, Derek had been pressing him to commit to a timeline. Greg had written back, "I don't know. When I'm actually with her, I don't feel the way you're describing. Maybe I'm reading it wrong." Derek's response was 4 lines. By the time I read it, it had already worked. I kept the email because it reminded me that Greg had hesitated. That somewhere in the middle of what was done to our marriage, there had been a moment when he had not been certain. And someone had spent 4 lines making him certain. I do not keep it to protect Greg. I keep it because it tells me the truth was still alive in there for a while. It just did not have anyone in its corner. I was in the house on the other side of the wall. I did not know I needed to be in the room. What would you do if you found out the person your partner trusted most had been working against you the whole time? Would you go after them legally, or would you let it go? Tell me in the comments. And if someone has ever quietly turned a person you loved against you, you already know how this story feels from the inside.